Good evening and welcome to LaRaviereThe on IntellectualRadio.com/iHeart station. I'm your host, Roman. We are breaking format today because of our special guest this evening. My guest is the former principal of the public school system, and now he's the president of Chicago Principals and Administration Association. Currently, he is seeking the mayoral candidacy of Chicago. Please give a Drive at 5 welcome to presumptive mayoral candidate Troy Anthony LaRaviere. Correct? LaRaviere. Okay, I'm sorry. Welcome to the Drive. You're going to get that from time to time.
I've gotten it all my life, brother. It's cool.
Please give IntellectualRadio.com/iHeart your background.
I'm a Chicagoan, born in Michael Reese Hospital. I grew up on the South Side, Chatham, Bronzeville, back of the yards, Washington Park, and West Englewood. I attended 4 different Chicago public elementary schools. I graduated from Dunbar High School on the South Side. I did the Navy, served in the Navy for a couple years, went to the University of Illinois for my undergraduate degree, my master's, and part of a PhD. I became a teacher, rose quickly through the ranks to become an assistant principal and then a principal. I can keep going.
I think that's cool cool. Now. All right. What is your platform?
So I'm saying I'm running for mayor of Chicago because Chicago does not have a mayor. That's the central aspect of the platform. Chicago does not have a mayor. The bankers have a mayor.
Why you say that, sir?
The investors have a mayor. The real estate developers have a mayor, but Chicago does not have a mayor. I'll give examples. It's an excellent question. Why do I say that? I say that because people like Henry Feinberg, a wealthy investor, can email the mayor and get into a conversation with the mayor about his desire for the mayor to take even more from city retirees than he already took. And then the mayor responds to him. These are the emails that the mayor was forced to release several months ago. The mayor responds to him and says, by bragging, he says, I am the only mayor in the country who's eliminated a benefit, not cut a benefit, eliminated a benefit. So there, he actually types this in an email to this man.
What are the benefits you're
he's bragging about the fact that he took away the healthcare benefits that city retirees earned that were set aside from paycheck to paycheck, but he eliminated them and sent these city retirees into poverty as a result. I mean, these people are getting pensions of $24,000, maybe $30,000 at most. You know how much the healthcare is going to cost? The healthcare plans cost once they got kicked off the city plan? About $24,000. So they would have to spend their entire income just to get healthcare. And he's bragging to this wealthy investor about the fact that he's the only mayor in the country who's ever done such a thing. And so Henry Feinberg has a mayor, but those city retirees don't have a mayor. And I want to be their mayor. Those kids at the National Teachers Academy, to give you another example. This is an elementary school in the South Loop, beautiful building. And it's occupied by mostly low-income African-American students. They're a high-performing school. They're a level 1 school, the top level you have in CPS. So they're high performing and they're fully enrolled. They don't meet any of the criteria that the mayor likes to claim are the criteria for closing the school down. They're high performing and they're fully enrolled. But the wealthy residents of South Loop, once again, you can see this in an email exchange that he was for released. They asked the mayor for the school, that they wanted to use it as a high school for their students who come from their wealthy households. And the mayor actually is shutting the school down, pushing those low-income Black and brown families out of that building so that he can get to the wealthy residents of the South Loop. So those wealthy residents, they have a mayor, but those kids at the National Teachers Academy and kids all across this city whose schools have been shut down or underfunded or understaffed, they don't have a mayor. And I want to be their mayor for people across this city, everyday people, whether your issue is education, whether your issue is the fact that you can't stay in a decent house. that some real estate developer has come and bought your building, flipped it, raised the rents, and sent or just flipped it and evicted you. They have these things called no-fault evictions where you can actually be paying your rent and they can still just evict you because they want you out, right? And it just so happens that many of these wealthy real estate developers just happen to be the main campaign contributors to Rahm Emanuel. And so those people who want to stay in their homes, who want an affordable rent, who want a decent place to stay in the city that they can afford to live in, they don't have a mayor. But those real estate developers do. I want to be a mayor for those folks that want decent housing, a decent neighborhood school, a decent pension, decent healthcare benefits for the city to live up to its obligation to make sure they have their retirement and healthcare benefits. People like that do not have a mayor, and I want to give them one.
Many people, including yourself, believe you were fired from CPS, your job, because of your support of former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. Walk us through this. What happened and why Rahm Emanuel, you think, were responsible to your firing because of your support of Bernie Sanders?
So, I mean, I'm an evidence-based man. And so we have, number one, I'm leading what we have to mention here is that I led the number one school in the district, the number one neighborhood school. When I got there,
what district is that, sir?
CPS, Chicago Public Schools. Chicago Public Schools is one district. And so of all the 600 schools, maybe about 500 of them are neighborhood schools. And I led the number one neighborhood school in the district. It was a top 10 school. It was already good when I got there. It was a top 10 school. It was the number one when I left. There were 79% of kids meeting standards when I got there. There were 89% within 2 years. I won 3 straight merit awards. I am one of only 4 principals out of 700 when I started who won that award from the mayor himself, 3 consecutive years. And the award wasn't just for having a good school. It was for continuously raising achievement year after year after year. And I'm one of only 4 who won one of the top 2 awards 3 consecutive years. So that's the background here. Why would you want to get rid of a principal like that? Well, in my first couple of years, I didn't criticize the mayor. I was busy trying to do the things that I did to make that the number one school in the district. But as I'm implementing evidence-based practices to make that happen, I'm seeing ideologically based practices and corrupt practices coming down from the district. I think what your audience has to also recall is that we had a CEO, Barbara Byrd Bennett, who is now in prison. But what your audience may not know is that the first CPS employee to speak out against her corruption when she was at the height of her power, when no FBI investigation was in sight and no one was talking about it, one person risked his career to draw attention to that corruption. That person is the one you're talking to right now. Right now, the Aramark custodial situation with filthy schools is in the news. This is 2018. You go back 4 years. Google Aramark, Aramark Chicago Tribune, Aramark WBEZ Radio, Aramark Chicago Sun-Times. And you'll see one principal in every single news story from 2014 sounding the alarm about the corrupt deal that is the Aramark Sodexo deal, where Rahm gave these people hundreds of millions of dollars for a contract, and they left our schools filthy.
So right? You're referring to, so people can be clear, you're referring to the janitorial contract.
The janitorial contract. That is in the news today. But there was one principal trying to get the corrupt deal with the mayor into the news 4 years ago. And so it's pretty clear why the mayor moved against me. As a result of a lot of that work that I was doing, several political candidates contacted me. When Fioretti was running for mayor, he contacted me. When Amara was running for mayor, she contacted me. Karen Lewis contacted me when she was about to run for mayor, and Chuy Garcia contacted me. Eventually, I decided to go with Chuy Garcia and became one of his campaign spokespeople and filmed commercials against our current mayor for Mr. Garcia. As we know, the mayor won. But as a result of a lot of the work I did with Chuy, the Bernie Sanders campaign came along. And what folks don't know is many of the people who ran the Chuy for Mayor campaign also ran the Bernie Illinois campaign. And because I had relationships with them, when the national Bernie Sanders movement or organization was looking for a person to feature in their commercials, they said you should get Troy. And so I then filmed commercials for Bernie Sanders. And then there was a commercial running nonstop in Chicago, criticizing Rahm Emanuel's connection with Hillary Clinton, because that's who Bernie Sanders was, his opponent was. And so I'm quite sure I did not endear myself to the mayor with a commercial running 24/7 criticizing his leadership of Chicago public schools. And so when you look at the fact that on one hand, he's awarding me when I wasn't saying anything about him year after year after year for the performance of my school and the raising of its performance. And then when I begin to speak the truth about his corrupt and incompetent policies and their impact on our young people, then all of a sudden, I'm someone he needs to get rid of. I think when you look at all of that evidence, the conclusion is pretty clear that this was an effort to maintain power, that my voice was becoming a little too strong in relationship to having an impact as a sitting principal criticizing the city mayor, and he wanted that voice silenced. But unfortunately, all he did was raise the profile of that voice.
According to the Chicago Tribune and other media outlets that are currently reporting a study saying Chicago is the most corrupt city in the U.S. What is your response to this report, and how would you, as mayor, change the culture of corruption in Chicago? Let's say people have spoken, you're the mayor. How would you change that? What's the number one thing of the culture of corruption you would change in Chicago?
Excellent question. That is actually my number one priority. It is my belief that we can't change education for the better until we deal with the corruption in education. We can't change police accountability until we deal with corruption within the police force. We can't create great housing policy until we deal with the fact that real estate developers get to donate to the mayor's campaign, and then the mayor then conducts housing policies based on their interests rather than the interests of the people. All of those things are based in corruption. And so one of the things that I did was I contacted my central beliefs is that we have what we need right here in Chicago to transform this city. This particular mayor, when he got in, he's shopping out the governance of our city out to Los Angeles and New York instead of looking right here. It's my belief that the folks who've been banging on the doors of City Hall for years and gotten the door slammed in their faces, who've been dealing with these issues for years, they have the solution. So, for example, we have something called the Better Government Association. Their number one priority is to point out corruption when they see it and uplift it and recommend policies to end that corruption. So one of the things I did was to reach out to the Better Government Association. And I asked them a question. I said, what are the top 10 or top 20 recommendations based on all of your experience with Chicago's corruption that you would recommend be put into city ordinances, state laws, and county laws to make our government as corruption-free as possible? Then I reached out to the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. The head of that is Ralph Martier, and asked them the same question because they know these things far better than I do. And so things, for example, like getting money, ensuring that people who want to do business with the city cannot contribute to the campaigns of the people running the city. Like if you are a real estate developer and you want TIF dollars, you can't contribute to the campaign of the mayor who then gets to decide where TIF dollars go. So if you're trying to do business with the city, you are forbidden to donate to the campaigns of the mayor or if you want to have a real estate development in a particular ward, you are forbidden from contributing to the campaign of the alderman in that ward. Like that is one example of many that are targeted to end corruption. Another one would be a donor match program that would uplift the contributions, the small contributions of everyday citizens. I think they have it in a state bill and a city ordinance right now. None of them are moving, but the idea is that
the same tier that they're trying to push in California in a small part of Compton, California, they're doing the same thing. Is that the same tier you're talking about?
So I don't know what they're doing in Compton, but what this program says is that if I donate $50, then there's a 6 times public match. So instead of you just getting $50, you get $300 as a small donation, and it goes up to a certain amount. After a certain amount, you can't get it matched. But in order to qualify for it, you have to agree not to take certain other types of donations. You have to agree to basically a corruption-free campaign contribution scenario. And what that does is magnify. So, for example, I've raised $20,000 in small contributions so far. I would have $120,000. So I've gotten over 400 people to make contributions to my campaign in very small amounts. If we had a donor match, someone like me who was able to get all of these small contributions would have $120,000. I guarantee you look at Rahm Emanuel's money, and if you look at the bulk of it, there are probably less than 400 people who gave it. But those 400 people, their voice counts for more because they have more money. And that's not healthy in a democracy. The voice of everyday people should matter as much. And so what the donor match program does is elevate their voices by elevating the value of their contributions to political campaigns. And so those are two of many examples of how we can institute practices within our political system and our election system that begin to address and weed out corruption.
Do you support term limits?
Term limits, this is what I think about. This is what I think what happened with term limits. So if the problem with government is corruption, because that's the problem, money in politics. If you have term limits and you don't get the money out of politics, then the wealthy corporations just get to buy new politicians every 4 to 8 years. That's not what we want. We want the money out of politics. I would support term limits if you took the money out of it. But if you don't have things like the donor match, term limits are not going to matter because wealthy investors just get to keep buying new politicians when term limits are up. We have to keep I think term limits take our focus off of the thing that matters most. And that is the unbalanced influence of money in politics.
Okay, for time's sake,
sure,
we're going to try and roll through these questions.
Sure.
Okay.
I'll try to be short in my response.
Former gubernatorial candidate Chris Kennedy, and you met with him recently, stated that Mayor Rahm Emanuel is forcing African Americans out of the city and replacing them with non-minorities, so to speak. However, research suggests that flood issues and high mandatory flood insurance rates are forcing whites out of the suburbs and replacing the whites with African Americans, and some are out of Illinois. What are your thoughts in regards to the mayor forcing African Americans out of the city and the flooding issues where blacks are moving into the suburbs and have no one saying anything about the flooding issue that is occurring in western, southern, suburban areas?
So I'll be quite frank with this. I think Rahm Emanuel's message to low-income people, particularly low-income people of color, but low-income people of all colors, but particularly of color, in particular black people, is get the hell out. That's his message. That when low-income black and brown people have their main source, or the main cause of bankruptcy is red light cameras and traffic tickets, and they're losing their cars by the thousands, the message the mayor is sending is that you can't afford. You don't have a city here that you can afford to live in. So get the hell out. When you can't stay in a home, when the policies of this administration put people who need affordable housing on 10-year waiting lists, and then you find out the Chicago Housing Authority is sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars that it could have used to get them into affordable housing, but they're just holding on to it because they don't want to spend it. They're saying there's no place for you here, so get the hell out. When black and brown people don't get the message, they say, okay, let me shut down 50 of your schools. So you have no place for your children to get a decent education anywhere near where you live. The message is get the hell out. Right? How clearer could he make it? Does that answer your question?
Chicago population is reducing, including the African American population, because of overtaxation. Many items like water bottles, and you had this discussion before, there is a 7 cents per bag for the tax for a plastic bag and also for a water bottle. Now, this is ridiculous according to people as well as senior citizens. You are seeing senior citizens walking out of the store with an arm full of groceries, going to their car or a cart that's showing the personal items of their, because they cannot afford the 7 cents per bag items if they shop in Chicago. The city, according to some researchers, have discovered that suburban are making a lot of money, just like western suburbs are gaining Oak Park, Westchester, DuPage County, including the sugar tax, which recently appealed. As mayor of Chicago, would you repeal the plastic bag or water bottle tax, and why not?
So I tie that with, so once it's a regressive tax, right?
Why would you say it's
and by
a
regressive tax, I mean any tax in which people who are low income or working people pay a higher share of their income in contribution to that tax, it's regressive. So red light cameras, it's a regressive tax. Traffic tickets, regressive tax. They target low-income people, and low-income people pay a higher share of their. A rich person gets a traffic ticket, $50. That's not a high percentage of their income. They don't have to do without anything to pay that ticket. But someone who's low income or working, they're going to have to not pay something else to pay that ticket. That means it's regressive. So whether it's a soda pop tax, a bag tax, these sewer fees, garbage fees, you name it, they're regressive. And so my answer to that question is the same as my answer for any regressive tax. One of the major reasons that we get regressive taxes is because we don't fight for progressive taxes, right? Taxes.
But how can a person, sorry to interrupt, how can a person who's listening, you saying progressive tax, how can somebody fight? I don't know anything about that.
Right. So it is our job. Well, it is our job to promote it. That's one of the reasons I'm talking about it right now. So progressive tax says we're going to have the people who we got to collect our income from where the money is. The money is in corporations. The money is in wealthy households. The money is in those who have a lot of disposable income. And so there are many ways. So, for example, the state progressive income tax, which says the more money you make, the higher percentage tax you have to pay. Right? There's a verse in I think the book of Luke, and this really helps people to understand it. There's a verse in the book of Luke where Jesus is standing outside of a temple, and they're watching people donate to the collection. And rich people are going by putting all kinds of money into the collection plate. And then a poor widow goes by and puts 2 copper coins in. And Jesus asks his disciples, who gave the most money? And he tells them, the poor widow gave the most. What her contribution is of the highest value, but because she gave from her need, like there's something she's not going to have because she gave that. Whereas the wealthy folks who were throwing all this money in were giving from their surplus, giving from their extra, that because she gave out of her basic necessities, her contribution was worth more. And so what a progressive tax says is that we are not going to fund our government by targeting the people for whom, and force them to have to give from their basic need, like that widow gave from her basic needs. We're going to collect our income. We're going to collect our revenue from those who can afford it most, for those who have the disposable income. And so one of the ways to do that is a progressive income tax at the state level. People have talked about possibly implementing at the city level. Folks have talked about a corporate head tax.
Would you be in favor if somebody proposed, let's do away with the grocery tax? Would you do away with that?
So that's the point. I would be for it if we pair it up with an effort to, because if you do away with that one, they'll come up with another regressive solution, right? We have to pair getting rid of regressive taxes with efforts to bring in progressive taxes, because the politicians are not going to pass a progressive tax without pressure from the people and the folks who are the ones who go to the ballot box, right? They need pressure. And so many people, like you said, don't know what a progressive income tax is. And it might be hard to get them to fight for one. But if you tell them the only way we can get rid of this bad tax, the only way we can get rid of these red light cameras is to pair it with to get a progressive income tax, I would write them both in the same law. I would get rid of the bad tax and then have a progressive tax in the same law. So you can't have one without the other. And that way you get people who want to get rid of the regressive taxes on board in the fight for progressive taxes. Because if they don't get on board with that fight, they're just going to replace the tax they wanted to get rid of with another tax they don't want.
Governor Runner wants to reinstate the death penalty in Illinois. Chicago has a high percentage of prison sentence turned over. Are you in favor of supporting this move or not in favor of supporting the death penalty?
I'm not in favor of the reinstatement of the death penalty. No.
Why?
So there are two reasons. One, this is a purely election season political move by the governor, right? The governor hasn't learned his lesson. He came in and he took the budget hostage in order to try and pass anti-worker legislation that he knew he couldn't pass any other way, right? If he had put that anti-worker legislation up for a vote, it would have failed. And he knew it would have failed. So he said, all right, no budget until you pass this, right? So he took our budget hostage and he failed. And so now he has this other piece of legislation, the reinstatement of the death penalty. He knows he can't get that passed in the Illinois legislature. And so what did he do? He took gun control legislation hostage and said, you're not going to pass this unless you give me the death penalty, right? And so there's a name for people who, when they can't get what they want done through the normal political process, they resort to taking hostages. We have a name for people like that. And I'm going to go ahead and let your audience figure out what that name is. But that's what our governor's doing. And so I don't support it, one, for that reason. But two, there's the policy of the death penalty itself. And the policy of the death penalty, we got rid of it for a reason. We got rid of it because of the possibility that we might be making a mistake in executing innocent people. After person after person after person got released from death row, after finding that DNA evidence said they weren't the one, when some person got up and identified them, that was absolutely the one, DNA evidence ended up showing that they weren't the one. And the governor even added something to this legislation. He changed the standard, because the standard is usually beyond a reasonable doubt, right? If you're convicted beyond a reasonable doubt, right, that's the standard to be convicted. He said you can only get the death penalty if it's beyond all doubt, right? And that sounds, like progress, if someone's not really paying attention, like, okay, they have to be convicted beyond all doubt. That makes more sense. But the problem is those are just words. Even with that standard, people are still going to make mistakes and convict someone in their minds without a doubt, without all, like a lot of those people who stood up against those folks who were on death row had absolutely no doubt. But then the DNA evidence showed that they were wrong. And so even though that he's creating this higher standard, people are still going to make mistakes and innocent people are going to be put on death row. And so as a policy, from a practical policy point of view, I don't think it works. And the last point of the policy piece, I just don't think it should be the state's business to be putting people to death when they don't have to.
How would you hold Chicago Police Department accountable for false arrest, corruption, and police brutality?
So there were 99 recommendations. One of the things that I like to do is, like I said earlier, rely on, like, we have experts right here in the city. And if we don't have them here in the city, we have evidence and research to show what works. Within police accountability, the document that has sort of the best, most thoroughly researched evidence is the Department of Justice report, right? And they made it extremely clear, right? They spent an entire year investigating and researching our police department and found, number one, that there's a pattern and practice of unconstitutional use of force. That's number one. Number two, that there are no accountability systems, no effective accountability systems in place. And number three, that the supervision and training of police officers is woefully lacking. And they had 99 recommendations. And the city hasn't even implemented, I think, a quarter of them yet. Right? You're going to have to talk to your mayor about that. But my guess would be, or my assumption would be, he doesn't want to implement them. He doesn't want to hold them accountable. And so my recommendation would be to implement all 99 with all deliberate speed.
The Fraternal Order of Police, or FOP, seems like they have more rights and leeway than an average citizen. Mm-hmm. Case in point, the Laquan McDonald case. It has been mentioned that the FOP were on the scene of that crime and talking to police and witnesses in that shooting. As mayor, would you create a statewide policy that forbids the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, of being on any crime scene to talk to an officer or any witnesses in that case? The reason I mention that is because it is documented proof in that document, and anybody can look it up, right, that the Fraternal Order Police did talk to the police officers and went to the Burger King and talked to the witnesses regarding the videotape.
Well, it's interesting. That's one of the 99 recommendations. It's not a statewide, though, because the mayor can't do a statewide policy, but he can certainly influence city policy. The mayor can push for a statewide policy and try to lobby lawmakers to pass one, and I would certainly do that. But the mayor has authority over the Chicago Police Department, and one of those 99 recommendations, it doesn't necessarily mention the Fraternal Order of Police, but it will still accomplish what you're trying to do, because it says that there can be no collusion. So not only with the Fraternal Order of Police, but the people can't even talk to one another. Like, that's one, to have a policy in place to prevent that kind of collusion from happening.
I mean, I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
And you made it perfectly clear. However, it's been going on, I think, a year and a half since they presented this.
Right.
And you said not even close to half.
Not even close to half. Because we don't have a monitor, because remember, one of the recommendations was to have a monitor, and the mayor tried to say, oh, yeah. And then he tried to back out of it to have this court-appointed monitor. Well, right now there is no court-appointed monitor. So legally, there's no one monitor. See, the monitor is supposed to look at those 99 recommendations and then track the implementation of them. Since no one's doing it, the Chicago Reporter, the magazine, the Chicago Reporter, has taken on that responsibility themselves. And so I would recommend to all of your listeners to go to the Chicago Reporter webpage, chicagoreporter.com, and look up. They have an ongoing database of all 99 recommendations and the status of each one, whether it's been completed, partially completed, or not completed at all. And I highly recommend, don't take my word for it. It is highly enlightening and eye-opening to go on the chicagoreporter.com webpage and look at the progress or lack of progress of those 99 recommendations. And I read the update on all 99 of them. And it's pathetic. It is criminal. And no one's being held accountable for it.
Let's go to your expertise, Chicago public school system. Chicago public schools have violated special education laws currently that's in the news. And now the state is demanding special education monitoring as well as full control after learning reforms have been implemented over funding for special education. It has been mentioned on the Drive at 5 before, the lack of funding in special education. As an educator such as yourself and head of the Chicago Principals Association, what is going on here and how can you explain to IntellectualRadio.com listeners why is there some type of corruption going on? Because they're using code words here to mess up people understanding. They're using reform, but the state wants control of that particular aspect. Why all of a sudden the state wants it if there's no play for play type of thing?
So I'll talk big picture and then try and narrow it down. We have to understand that the centrality of corruption comes into play when you take into account, when you look at the fact that our district spends about $6 billion per year. That's our district budget, $6 billion. Now, if you're a private company or some corporation or banker looking to make a profit, that's $6 billion is a gold mine for you, right? And so if you can donate to the campaign of the person who's going to control that $6 billion, which is our mayor, and get him to shape policy in a way that steers money towards you, and you in for a windfall, you in to make some profits. But there's one problem. In order to start spending the money on you, you have to stop spending it on what you're currently spending it on. Teachers for classrooms, special education services. You hear what I'm saying? And so one of the things this mayor has done, for example, we are currently number 857 out of 858 Illinois school districts in the ratio of students to certified staff. What that means is that in the average Illinois school, you have, with 600 kids, you have 58 staff members. Remember that. Average Illinois school, 600 kids, 58 staff. You know how many staff members a 600 student school in Chicago has? 37. That means our kids have 21 fewer staff members for the same number of students. So that's 21 people that Chicago Public Schools is no longer paying because it's a purposeful disinvestment in their salary so that they can then take that money and give it to a custodial company that left our schools filthy. Right. And so that's the same reason. So that's the disinvestment on the district-wide level. But they also find little things within the district to disinvest from. Special education is another one. About a sixth of the district's budget is special education, almost $1 billion. And so if you can stop spending money on that, that's more money you can divert to your campaign contributors, to your wealthy people in the finance industry. And so that is the big picture of what's happening in special education. You can't give money to your buddies if you're spending it on special education kids. And so now let's go into special education and see what they've actually done. And so they've created policies that underfund special ed. And then they've created rules that make it hard to get a service to a student. The student's services are determined by his individualized education program, the IEP. And so they instituted dozens of new rules that make it impossible to put a service into a student's IEP, even if the student needs it. Right? And I can go into detail about what they are, but I have a feeling you don't want those kinds of details. But they've made it virtually impossible to do that.
Well, just for timing's sake.
For
timing's sake. So...
But the big thing though is that when they underfunded special ed, they created a process called an appeal, where certain schools, well, any school who wanted to, could ask for more money. And so what happened during the appeals process is that if you were a school serving predominantly white students, you typically got what you asked for. If you served predominantly Black or brown populations, you did not get. In fact, the 10 schools with the highest percentage of white students got a total of over $1 million. The 10 schools with the lowest percentage of white students, which were all majority African American, got 0. If you are a majority white school, you got 60% of what you asked for in these special education appeals. If you're a majority Latino school, you got 14%. And if you were a majority black school, you got just 9%. 60% to 9%. Right? That is a crime committed against those kids in those low-income African Americans and Latino schools. And so the depth of their disinvestment and the criminality of it is so jarring, so corrupt and immoral.
So I have a couple of follow-ups for timing's sake.
Sure.
Briefly. Why, since this information, I know it's fairly brand new, no, like, I'm going to file a lawsuit to say why and to figure out what's really going on, to put everything in documentation, why there's no lawsuit going on, or are you willing to file a lawsuit in regards to this matter? Because it sounds like a lot of money is involved and a lot of corruption is going on, and the people who are missing out are the children.
So my organization, the Chicago Principals and Administrators Association, we took the lead in the research that discovered what I just told you. But we also partnered with legal advocacy organizations all over the city just for that purpose. You know, we don't have the money or the expertise at the Chicago Principals Association to file that kind of lawsuit. So we connected with the Shriver Center, the Health Council for the Legal Council for Health Justice, and several other attorney-based advocacy organizations to see if we could construct a lawsuit, and even a private law firm. And that work is ongoing. Lawsuits are no joke. But many of these same organizations also allied with us to call for the state investigation that you mentioned earlier. So the state thing isn't out of the blue. CPS, we talked to for over 1.5 years, and they kept ignoring us about this. And so we went to an Illinois State Board of Education meeting and asked them, several organizations and representatives, including myself, spoke to them and asked for an investigation into CPS's practices. We forced their hand. They did the investigation. It was more like an inquiry than an investigation. And at the end of that inquiry, found in our favor, found that the things we said were occurring were actually true. And then as a result, appointed, or said that, I don't think they've appointed it yet, but decided that they would appoint a monitor for CPS for 3 years to look into, to oversee their special education practices, to ensure that the things that we found can no longer happen. And in addition to that, I've also filed legislation in Springfield, SB 3514. It passed the Senate and it's up in the House. It could be voted on any day now. That outlaws many of the practices that CPS engaged in to stop these kids from getting those services. So we've gone the legal route. We've gone to the State Board of Education, and I filed legislation to stop this.
My question to you, I would say, if I'm listening to this and they said they're going to appoint a monitoring, I would say, here we go again. They're going to be in charge. They're part of the corruption. And now they're going to be in charge of appointing someone that's going to monitor it.
So that's where we, I think, have a disagreement. This is the Illinois State Board of Education. And so if you can point out some corrupt practice in the Illinois State Board, let me know. I know they have folks appointed by Ronator, but the people who work in the day-to-day jobs, you know, it's kind of like Trump is over the Justice Department, right? But you have people who work right here in the Chicago branch of the Justice Department who've been doing these jobs for decades, who continue to do the same thing that they've always been doing. Now, Trump has different priorities, but they're not corrupt people. These are career folks who are working in the Department of Justice. And so we have folks at the Illinois State Board of Education who kind of have the same thing happening there in relationship to, this is their job. This may not be a priority of Ronator. It may or may not be. But for whatever reason, they found if they were corrupt, I don't think they would have, or as corrupt as we think they were. I don't think they would have found in our favor in the first place. They would have allowed CPS to continue to do what CPS is doing. In fact, we had the same thought when we went to them. We were like, this is kind of risky because these folks are working under honor. We don't know if they're actually going to do a legitimate investigation. Maybe they're going to just half-ass it and find in CPS's favor. And we were pleasantly surprised at a relatively thorough investigation, a finding that all 4 of the issues we brought to them were true and that CPS had been violating the rights of special education students. But I still think part of your point I agree with in relationship that we can't just hand it over to them and trust them. We have to continue to be like in their whole investigation process, for example. We were on them the whole time. What about this? What about this? But this part of your practice and the way you're investigating isn't going to get the truth out because you're relying on people to volunteer and these people are afraid for their jobs. So you need you need folks to be able to testify anonymously. And so even as they're doing the investigation, we're sort of having this mindset like you, not quite sure if these people are going to do it the right way. And I think even now that they found in our favor, we still have to be on them. We still have to monitor the monitor to make sure they're doing what they need to do. And that's what we plan on doing.
Are you in favor of an elected school board? The reason I asked this question is it was on the ballot. People overwhelmingly voted for it. The mayor decides to ignore it and continues to appoint people on the board, which you went toe-to-toe with. As mayor, would you follow what the people have spoken about and say, we want that to be, have a say-so in this and have an elected school board?
So there's a yes, but. And so one, it's not the mayor that's ignoring it. The mayor doesn't have power to change it. The state has the power to change it. It's a state law that gave the mayor the power. Now, the mayor is using his friends in the legislature to hold the legislation and to stop it. But technically, it's the state legislature that gets to decide who has control. And I'm sure Senator Cullerton, who's an ally of Rahm, is holding that legislation because Rahm wants it held. But 2, there's a bigger point, right? I'm for an elected school board. But the elected school board is supposed to accomplish 2 things. It's supposed to give us a school board that's representative and competent, right? Just because it's elected doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get either one of those. It depends on how you structure the elections. For example, in the local school councils, you can't just be anybody and run for a local school council seat. One of their criteria. Right. And one of the criteria is that you have to be a parent in the school. Well, that criteria helps it be more democratic because you have to be a parent. It makes sure that local school council is going to be representative. It's going to represent parents who have their kids in the school. One of the other things you can be is a teacher. Well, having to be a teacher in the school to get on the local school council ensures that there'll be some people on that board who have competence in education. Right? You want representation and you want competence. And so what does that look like on the state level? How can we go beyond an elected school board and structure that election so that there are criteria that actually ensures that we'll get people who are representative of the people who attend the schools and competent to do the job? And lastly, the other thing that we need if we're going to have an elected school board is the same kind of election reform that I talked about earlier, like a donor match program. Because if we have an elected school board, guess who's going to start throwing millions of dollars into the election? The people who want to privatize the district and make money off of it. They'll find their candidates and they'll put their candidates up to run and they'll flood out everybody else's voice. We have to think about this. The people who are going to elect that school board are the same people who elected the mayor and the city council. What is going to guarantee us that rubber stamp city council that does everything the mayor wants them to, right? The same people who elected them are going to elect this school board. What are we going to put in place to make sure that, or to increase the likelihood that when we get this elected school board, that the people who get elected will actually represent the people in the district. And so I think a donor match program would help that out. I think criteria that says you have to be a parent in a neighborhood school or an educator in a neighborhood school for certain positions also increase the likelihood that we not just get an elected school board that ends up being a rubber stamp, but an elected school board that actually serves the needs of the people in the schools.
Are you in favor of some of the control goes back to Springfield? The mayor has so much control, so much say so. At CPS, some people say we got to take some of this power away from them.
The state level?
Well, let me explain.
Sure.
Mayor Daley, during the early 90s, when it was in Springfield, test scores were low. He was livid. He went down to Springfield. At that time, it was Jim Ryan, I believe, Governor Ryan, at that point in time. He raised a lot of sand down there, and they gave him full control. That's where you have the situation that we have now. What I'm saying, would you decide or kind of like piece together some type of legislation so it can be a balance of power type of thing? So when it comes to CPS and our students, that the mayor doesn't have full authority. It has to go to Springfield. It has to go through certain branches of government that we all know.
And so I would do exactly what I just mentioned. So I talked about these criteria that you can use. So I'm assuming you're saying if we don't get an elected school board, would we do this? So if we don't get an elected school board, I'm going to do exactly what I just said the state should do. So I said the state should create criteria. And so if I still have control, I'm going to give up some of that control myself by saying, all right, public school advocates, Chicago Teachers Union, principals, parent organizations, raise your hand. Let's come together and create the criteria by which I have to stick to in my picks. You hear what I'm saying? So if we decide you have to have parents, some of these positions have to be parents, then I have to pick parents. You know what I'm saying? If we decide that some of these teachers some of these positions on the school board have to be educators, then if that's what we decide, then that's how I have to limit myself. And so basically what I'm going to be doing is creating a model for the state to use when they eventually decide to have an elected school board. We may decide, you know what? We want 3 university professors on the school board who have expertise in 3 different areas of education, curriculum and instruction, budget, finance, and leadership, and cognitive psychology, which is the principles of learning. Imagine that. 3 positions on the board who actually know something about teaching and learning. We may decide we want those positions on the board. Then as mayor, I would be restricted to those kinds of criteria in my picks. And in doing so, I'll be giving the state a roadmap to follow when they eventually create elected school board legislation. Does that answer your question?
Yes, for timing's sake. Do you believe teachers union should get involved in political matters outside of their jurisdiction? The reason why I'm saying this is because Chicago Teachers Union have been basically putting their money, their efforts in political campaigns such as automatic, governor, mayoral, Cook County government. The list goes on and on. You're an educator. Should you?
Oh, I love this question.
Would you like? Well, go ahead, answer it then, since you know.
So I'll give you the scenario that I based my answer on. I was the principal at Johnson School in North Lawndale, the poorest community in this city, and I was also principal at Blaine in Lakeview, the wealthiest community in this city. And my kids in North Lawndale came to school on day 1 of kindergarten, years behind my kids at Blaine. It's day 1 of kindergarten, and they're already behind. How is Johnson to fail in school and they're behind on day 1 of kindergarten? They're not behind. Then how is Johnson to fail in school? It's not the school that failed them if it's day 1 of kindergarten. They've been failed long before they ever reached the school system, right? They've been failed by the fact that they're exposed to lead paint in Lawndale 4-1. Excuse me, 1 out of 4. Whereas in Lakeview, your chances are 0%. They've been failed by the fact that their parents don't have access to decent jobs that make income like those parents in Lakeview make to expose their children, right, to the things those Lakeview kids get. They've been failed by the fact that they don't have access to decent health care, nutrition. Now, where am I going in relationship to your question? Right, that when these kids show up, our teachers have to deal with the failure of the mayor, the failure of the alderman, the failure of the state rep to take care of these things that the teachers then get blamed for. We end up getting blamed for their failure. You hear what I'm saying? And so as a teacher, as a principal, there is no issue that is up for discussion that does not affect the children that I have to serve, that does not affect how I end up being perceived as an educator, because I have to deal with some politicians' failure to get these kids the services they need. When I was at Johnson, we tripled the number of kids meeting math standards. Tripled it. They went from 12% to 36%. We moved mountains, but we still only have 36%. Right? And we only have 36% because we had to start at 12. And we started at 12 because of failures that did not belong to us. They belong to politicians, businessmen, families that weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. And so as an educator, I'm for any effort to point the attention on where the attention needs to be pointed and ameliorate or deal with policies and issues that will ensure these kids come to us on day one of school ready to learn. That's jobs, that's housing, that's healthcare, that's nutrition. There's nothing that doesn't impact or affect our ability to do our jobs with kids. So I think the CTU should get involved in every single issue that impacts the children they serve.
I have a follow-up question to that, but we're
Sure.
we're out of time. So thank you so much. Don't be a stranger to the Drive at
Man,
5,
I
okay?
love it, man.
Yeah.
My apologies for that start too, man.
No, you mentioned it. I didn't. Thanks to Oral Winfrey, our executive producer, Wanda, who's behind the scenes. When I guess we'll have our Memorial Day special next week. See you. Have a good week, everyone.